Hi, I'm David Marchant, the founder of OffshoreAlert, which investigates participants in high-value cross-border finance with an emphasis on high-confidentiality jurisdictions. Our specialty is exposing investment fraud while it's in progress. Enjoy our content.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scilla Alecci. I'm a reporter with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and I'm here today with my colleague from the Netherlands, Karlijn Kuijpers. We are going to talk about Luanda Leaks. So just to start, I'm going to give you a little presentation about ICIJ and how this project started. ICIJ is a non-profit news organization. We are based in Washington, but we have a global presence. We do international investigations, and we do this thanks to our partners around the world. Karlijn is one of our partners. In this case, the Luanda Leaks was a project based on more than 700,000 files related to the business dealings of Isabel dos Santos. Dos Santos is Africa's richest woman, a billionaire, according to Forbes estimates, and she's also the daughter of Angola's former president, José Eduardo dos Santos, who was who governed the country from 1979 to 2017. As you may all know, Angola is also one of the world's poorest countries, and so we analyzed how Isabel dos Santos' business was impacting the country. But not only that, and I will talk to you later about how this is a global story. The origin of the files, for those who wonder, they came to ICIJ from this Paris-based advocacy group called the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa. We published the project in January this year, and after we published PLAF, the advocacy group revealed that the information, the files, had come to them from Rui Pinto, who, as some of you may know, he also was a whistleblower in the Football League's scandal. He's currently in Portugal, and the trial related to his charges is ongoing. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, it's all being delayed to next year. So the case is ongoing. The project Luanda Leaks was a journalistic investigation done by more than 100 journalists around the world and from 2,000 countries. Why? Why so many people for a project about Angola? Well, we realized early on that it was not just about one country. Why? Because Isabel dos Santos was able to become a billionaire thanks to the help of enablers, facilitators, accountants, lawyers around the world. So we needed journalists from all these countries to analyze the work of those people. In the data, we find emails, bank documents, contracts, audits, balance sheets, a variety of information. And mostly the data was from 2012 to 2016, but in general, it included data from the 1990s to 2018. Our ICIJ has a team of data journalists who is always in charge of looking into the data meticulously, but also to cross-check leaked files with public records. And by doing that, we mapped Isabel dos Santos' business around the world. And we found that she and her husband, her late husband, who passed away a few weeks ago, Sindica Docolo, in total they had links to more than 400 companies. When I say they had links, it's because in some cases they were the owners, in some cases the shareholders, or in some other cases the structure was much more complex. So they still had links, but through many different intermediaries. In all, the couple had companies in a variety of jurisdictions, obviously not just Angola, but also a lot of those offshore financial centers that provide a lot of benefits on taxes. And the business sectors too were diverse, from energy to telecom to diamond, media, and so forth. We started the project by analyzing what she was telling the public. Dos Santos is a very public figure. She's a famous businesswoman, and since she was young, she headed a lot of different companies, and she's always told the public in interviews and in conferences that she was, that her success was due to her being so business savvy and able to turn around a company. What we found in the data was something different, though. In fact, we were able to find a few different patterns that kind of made her, that we understand made her the rich person that she is today. Starting with the fact that obviously she was the daughter of the president at the time, which means that she had a lot of she had the opportunity of taking advantage of those close relationship with the government. In fact, we saw that she was given, since she was young, lucrative stakes in key sectors like diamond, oil, and telecom. Later, we found that some of her lawyers, some of these were based in Portugal, even helped the Angolan government draft decrees that would allow the president to give his daughter key contracts. Here you will see an email taken from these leaked documents, where you clearly see it's in Portuguese because it's from Portuguese lawyers talking about a presidential decree that is going to change how a contract, urban development contract, is awarded. Another pattern that we saw is that she used a lot of intercompany loans between her shell companies to move money between those subsidiaries. Then we found that she also used loans from her own banks to finance a project that had the involvement of government agencies. And finally, we saw a lot of consultancy agreements that were awarded to her shell companies or her husband's shell companies. And we'll see now how these consultancy agreements raised a lot of red flags. So the key findings were a few. I really suggest you go to the ICAJ website to read the stories, but if we want to sum that up, we saw how Western business advisors, lawyers, accountants, and so forth helped her and her husband move money away from Angola or avoid taxes, and in many cases turned a blind eye to red flags involving her business. We also see how around 2013, when a lot of banks were shutting their accounts because of allegations of corruption and in media reports, they actually were able to set up their own banks. And finally, obviously the case is still ongoing, but the current Angolan government has announced that months ago announced that they were investigating Dos Santos and her husband, and they accused them of stealing more than $1 billion from the state. Following this, also the Portuguese government has started to seize some of her assets. And Karlijn, we talked to you about the development in the Netherlands. So I'm using here two examples to explain what we found. These two examples relate to two of the Angola's key sectors. One is diamond. Starting in 2012, Dos Santos' late husband, Docolo, formed a joint venture with an Angolan state agency, which trades diamond. You can see the scheme, the structure of the company here. The company was a Maltese joint venture. And Sodium, if you can see, it's highlighted in this yellow circle. Sodium is the Angolan state agency. The blue circle indicates Dos Santos' husband's company. The two became co-owner of this Victoria Holding, which is based in Malta, which eventually bought a struggling jewelry company in Switzerland called the Grisogono, which is now bankrupt. What is interesting in this case is that, as you can see, there is Angolan state money going into the joint venture, which is controlled by, at that point, the son-in-law of the president, who not only controls the company, but he also, during the process, also receives a $4 million success fee for the successful completion of this business deal. We asked Dokolo at the time, and he said that he reinvested the money in the company, and it was just basically exactly for that, because he was able to complete the deal successfully. But it is interesting, obviously, for journalists, and I'm sure for other figures as well, professionals as well, that a politically exposed person was able to use some of the money from one of the country's one of the world's poorest country to funnel money to his BVI venture. And this happened even though their company was being audited for accounting purposes by some of the biggest accountants like PwC. Case again, PwC was their Maltese auditors. What is interesting for us is that in the file we see how the interactions between PwC accountants and Isabel dos Santos and her husband's advisors. We see, for example, that in one case, regarding to this $4 million success fee, in one case, PwC asks who is behind the company that received the success fee, and Dos Santos advisors said it was not a related party. However, through the leaked documents, we were able to verify that it was not just a related party. It belonged to the same Dokolo, the Dos Santos husband. What is interesting is that during the 2016 audit, the Dos Santos advisors were not able to provide any document about this $4 million transaction, and they wrote a document on the spot to comply with the PwC's request. You can see it on the screen. And it seems that from the documents that we saw from the financial statements that it was accepted as it was. So just to sum it up, the accountants asked the right questions when they asked who was the receiver of these $4 million $4 million success fee. But then when they were responded with basically a lie, they did not go through and ask for other documents, basically. Just to go back, I wanted to say that obviously we asked PwC about their behavior, and in this, not just in this case, but in other audits that they did for the Santos companies, and they said that they were going to investigate and they would take action to terminate any ongoing work with the Santos and their family members. Then I want to go and talk to you about oil. Again, another key sector in Angola. And again, here we see a very interesting pattern that we also identify for diamonds, which is basically how a shell company related to Dos Santos and her husband received government contracts and government money to basically continue to do business. In this case, we are talking about 2016, when Sonangol, which is Angola's state oil company, was terribly in debt. They were owing dollars to a lot of creditors. So the government decided to restructure the company, which would also mean restructure the country's oil sector. But who would do that? The events that followed were kind of interesting for us, and again, the case is still ongoing. This is what happened, and I'm going to give you only the facts in chronological orders, which I think are interesting enough for you to make a judgment. So the oil sector needed restructuring. We know it from leaked emails that the Dos Santos Portuguese lawyers began to help draft a decree, presidential decree, that would then help the president decide to establish a government committee to do the restructuring. The government committee then gave the contract to a Malta shell company. The contract was worth more than $9 million. We know from the documents that this company belonged to Dos Santos and her husband. Okay, it was called Wise, but as we know from the emails, it was not wise because it had no human resources and no know-how. So Wise wasn't able to do what the committee wanted them to do, so they hired Boston Consulting to do that, to analyze what was the problem with the oil sector and come up with a plan. After this happens, Isabel dos Santos becomes the head of Sonangol. So again, the president gives her the chairmanship of the most important company in the country. We know from the documents again that the Maltese shell company is closed, but another one very similar with a very similar name is open in Dubai. This Dubai consulting company signed a contract with Sonangol. Our leaked files and many other documents that we found through reporting confirmed that this company was actually owned by one of her closest friends. And in 2017, what happens is that her father resigns and a new president comes in, João Lorenzo, who's still in the government today. So he decides to fire Isabel dos Santos, but the Dubai company that had these contracts with Sonangol was still there. And in fact, a few hours after she loses her job, we know that some bankers, Sonangol bankers, are requested to pay $38 million to that Dubai company. Okay, the Dubai company again belonged to one of her friends. So these are just the facts that show you these patterns that we have identified before, meaning lawyers, Portuguese lawyers helping draft the presidential decrees, the president, her father giving her government contract, and her shell companies that belong to her getting millions of dollars, and Western advisors, in this case, again, PwC and Boston Consulting, working for her shell companies. Of course, again, this case is still ongoing, but certainly it makes you understand why we believe that this was a global story, and it was also a case study in a way for kleptocracy that deserved being communicated to the public for sure, because this is clearly not the only example. If this happened in Angola and came out just because of leaked files and many reporters working on this for months, imagine how many of these cases are there. And obviously ICIJ is always willing to know more, so if you have information, please let them know. And I will now give Karlijn the floor.
Thank you, Scilla. So I am one of the journalists that participated in the Luanda Leaks investigation. I'm a reporter from the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we we published the investigations in newspaper Trouw and in newspaper Het Financiële Dagblad. The stories we had in the Netherlands were two types. So one type of stories we wrote about was about the role of the Netherlands as a country where Isabel dos Santos had many companies, so mailbox companies that were located in the Netherlands. Another type of story was Dutch constructing companies participating in some big projects that Isabel dos Santos was involved in. And I'll tell you a bit about the two types of projects we investigated. I also was one of the reporters that went to Luanda in Angola to investigate the impacts of the project. So I'll tell you a bit more about that as well. But I'll start with the Dutch mailbox companies. So every corporate structure Isabel dos Santos had one or more mailbox companies in the Netherlands. And in this way, the Netherlands facilitated the constructions and the looting Scilla explained to you about. One thing I want to put some focus on is the role of the Dutch corporate service providers. And the interesting thing is that in our documents, we found that the Isabel dos Santos' Dutch companies, they moved from one corporate service provider to the other, and then to another one, and then on to another one. So to give you one example, XM Energy BV, it's a Dutch holding company controlled by Isabel dos Santos and Sindicato Colo. It was first administered by Intertrust, which is one of the biggest corporate service providers in the Netherlands. And it stayed there until 2013. That's the year in which Bloomberg published the first articles about Isabel dos Santos, and these were one of the first publications about the role of Isabel dos Santos in corruption and in, so the first negative articles about Isabel dos Santos. At that moment, Intertrust decided they no longer wanted to serve Isabel dos Santos, and her companies moved to United Trust, which is a bit of a smaller corporate service provider, but still, it's not a tiny one. She stayed there until 2016. And then they moved on to Trust Company Amsterdam. And we have some emails in the leaked documents, which are very interesting, because one of the advisors to Isabel dos Santos, he writes in 2015, so just before her company moved from United Trust to Trust Company Amsterdam, that she had to look for a corporate service provider that's smaller and that's more under the radar. So these documents show that they were really looking for, maybe you could say a place to hide, a place where they would not be scrutinized as much. And they decided to move to Trust Company Amsterdam, which is called a third-class corporate service provider by one of her advisors. But that wasn't the final step. So in 2018, so they moved to Trust Company Amsterdam and in the third-class corporate service provider in 2016. They stayed there until 2018. And then from that moment on, the company, XM Energy BV, is no longer served by a corporate service provider. And what they did is that they moved the company to a co-working space at Schiphol, close to the airport, the international airport. The corporate service provider, so Trust Company Amsterdam, stopped its services. One of the directors of Trust Company Amsterdam became a director of XM Energy, of the company, and someone else made the annual accounts. And this is a common pattern we see in many of these investigations we do in the Netherlands. We saw it in the Troika laundromat, which was an investigation into a Russian money laundering machine. We saw it in the FinCEN files, a recent ICIJ investigation. And this pattern, it's a way to avoid scrutiny, because in Dutch law, the Dutch central banks controls corporate service providers if they combine the service of providing a director, an address, and the annual accounts. And what we see more and more now that the Dutch central bank is looking more into these corporate service providers is that they're cutting up their services to kind of avoid the scrutiny. So they don't fall within the definition of the Dutch law, and in that way they can really avoid scrutiny. So in the end, I think it's an interesting impact of better controls by the Dutch government, which causes companies like the ones owned by Isabel dos Santos to kind of go underground to avoid the legislation and the controls. We also saw in the data that so for the corporate service providers, we see that they go from a big company to a smaller one and then go underground. For the banks, we know that Isabel dos Santos' Dutch companies had bank accounts at ING Bank. They were closed in 2014, and then they couldn't find any other bank in the Netherlands who was willing to take them on as a client. So then in 2014, they decided to go to United Bank in Curaçao and to Banco BIG, which is one of the banks that was partly controlled by Isabel dos Santos. It's a Portuguese bank. So there you also see that they move from a big Dutch bank to a Curaçao bank or to a Portuguese bank. Just to wrap up this part of the role of the Dutch mailbox companies and the corporate service providers, earlier this year, Dutch authorities announced that they are now investigating Exim Energy, which is one of the Isabel dos Santos' mailbox companies in the Netherlands, for not paying back a loan. And we asked them whether they are also investigating the Dutch facilitators, so the corporate service providers and the directors that serve the company, and that's not clear yet. The Dutch prosecutor is saying they're looking into every actor involved. Now we'll move to the research we did in Luanda. So we went there with a number of reporters that were part of the ICIJ consortium. And what we mainly wanted to do is investigate the impacts of Isabel dos Santos' activities in Angola, in the country she comes from and she derives a lot of her wealth from. So we went to Luanda, the capital, and this is a picture of Luanda's Bay. And the first thing that's really striking when you are there is that you see Isabel dos Santos' companies everywhere. So this is one of the main roads in the country. You see Unitel, which is one of her telecom companies. You see her banks. You see her phone companies. So she is everywhere, although she is not present in Angola anymore herself. Her companies are still there, and they're very visible. We investigated one project which is called the Corimba Boulevard project. This is a project for the redevelopment of the Luanda Bay, which is a bay close to the capital. It's a boulevard in the capital, and it's a prestigious project where they want to develop new beaches, new land, office space, luxury houses, etc. And Isabel dos Santos is very involved in this project. In one interview, she said the project was very close to her heart. We know that her lawyers drafted the presidential decree that was used to initiate the project. So the presidential decree her father in the end signed, her father the president. The project was granted to a consortium of Urbanvest, which is a company controlled by Isabel dos Santos, and Van Oort, which is a Dutch dredging company. The project was granted without a public tender, although this is obliged under Angolan law. This was not done in this case. And what was very striking is that the project cost about $600 or $700 million. Urbanvest, Isabel dos Santos' company, got 193 million or so, and these costs were not specified at all. So there was 50 million for project development, 70 million for something else, and this was in stark contrast to the cost that was specified by Van Oort, the Dutch dredging company, because there every expense was specified and it was very detailed. So that was very striking, and experts told us that this was very suspicious. It was very well possible that
money was would go to Isabel dos Santos, while it was not very clear what she did in exchange for that. Next to that, her company, so Urbinvest, had no experience whatsoever in this type of project. And her role in the project was planning the project, design, project management. So that was her role. And we went to Luanda to investigate this project because we had minutes of meetings with community members in our data. And in these community meetings, the people told that they had concerns about the human rights impacts of this project, because they were afraid of forced evictions, that people would be pushed off their land to make place for the Isabel dos Santos' project. In the data, there was also information that no forced evictions were needed, but we still had doubts because there were reports in Angolan media about forced evictions at the project site. So we had no other option than going there and investigating it ourselves. And what we found was that hundreds of families had been expelled from their land on a spot that was in the middle of this Corimba Boulevard project, really in the middle of the city. These people who lived there on this spot of land, they had moved there during Angola's civil war, and they had lived there for over 10 years. And when they were expelled from their land in 2015, they were not informed in advance. One early morning, police, the army and the Marines showed up. They were locked in on the island. No food and no water was allowed on the island, and they had to stay there for days. So they were kind of weakened. There was quite some violence by the army and the police. Two people died during the occupations. Tear gas was used against them, water cannons, etc. And after a number of days, their houses got demolished, and they were kicked out, and they became homeless. Something that we really had to investigate in Angola was, so we knew these people lived on land that was part of the Isabel dos Santos' project, of the Corimba Boulevard project, but what we still had to confirm was the causality, so whether they had been moved for this project or for something else. So what we did is that we made a timeline. In our documents, we saw that in early 2013, a meeting had taken place between Urbinvest, so Isabel dos Santos' company, and Van Oort. Then in May 2013, so a few months later, the project was approved by the president. And then 3 weeks after this approval, the army, police, and marine occupied the land. And shortly after that, a report was written for Urbinvest and Van Oort, concluding that the land was empty and there were no forced evictions or no evictions needed to clear the land. And this is striking because they could only have concluded this because the land had been cleared just a few weeks before. So the timing of this report is very interesting. And then 3 years later, in 2016, the project was finally granted to Urbinvest and Isabel dos Santos and Van Oort. We also interviewed quite some people in Luanda to ask whether these people had actually been evicted for Isabel dos Santos' project. Some people confirmed and some denied. They said it was for another project, a road project that was also planned on that spot of land. And we controlled this. We checked this claim by looking at satellite images, and there we could see that the part of land that would be needed for the road had been cleared long before. So the part of the land for the road was emptied already, and after that, people were kicked off their land to empty the whole plot of land. And this way we could confirm that there was no other explanation than that these people had been expelled for Isabel dos Santos' project. These people have never been compensated. They live in very poor circumstances. This is one of the pictures we took there. They live in small huts on a former wasteland.
they have very poor water quality, no drinking water. There are many diseases there, and they're still waiting for compensation. They say they have the right to be compensated, but they have never received any compensation. I'll show you one other picture. So they live with up to 10 people in one of these huts. They have to share everything. They have to cook in there, sleep in there, study in there, everything. So the circumstances are very poor. And one striking thing is that where they live now, it's just across from where they used to live before. So they still can see the place where they used to live. And that place is still empty because the Corimba Boulevard project was cancelled by the current president. So the project never was developed. And these people feel they have been expelled for nothing, because now the land they lived on is empty, not used, but they are still not allowed to go back. So, as I said, the João Lourenço, the Angola's new president, cancelled the project in March 2018. And what we saw in our data is that just before the project got cancelled, Van Oort, the Dutch dredging company, paid 6 million to Investors' bank account in Cape Verde. And they never explained to us what this payment was for. They said it had to do something with money they needed in foreign currencies, but they never gave detail about what kind of services the money was needed for. So this is still a big question mark, why that money had to be moved to Cape Verde just before the project got cancelled. And then some words about how the companies responded to our revelations. The Dutch dredging company Van Oort says it didn't know that people had been expelled from their land for the project they were involved in, and they say they will make sure that people will be compensated. There have not been big advancements in this over the past year, and that's, according to Van Oort, that's mainly due to the COVID-19 crisis. The Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs put pressure on the companies to make sure that people will be compensated, and Isabel dos Santos denied that the people were expelled for a project she was involved in. And at the moment, not a lot has really changed for the people living in these slums. They're still waiting for compensation. All right, so this was my part of the presentation. We still have some minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please ask them and we'll do our best to answer them. So there is one, any enforcement actions against banks or corporate service providers? In the Netherlands, we don't know of any, but Scilla, you can answer it for the rest of the world, maybe.
So we know that the European Banking Authority at one point announced that they were looking into that, but at this point, there's been no enforcement. It's more like they opened an investigation, is what we know. Yeah. Same for corporate service providers or accountants, maybe. We know that Portugal has announced an investigation into many accounting firms, but they didn't disclose the names, and the investigation is still ongoing, and there hasn't been any outcome yet.
Another question is, does she have any good qualities? What is she like as a person in terms of intelligence, abilities, etc.? Do you want to take that one, Scilla?
So first thing I want to say is that we've tried to talk to her many times, but it was very difficult. We started first with her PR firm, and then it was mainly mediated through lawyers. But I may say that, from what we can gather from the information, I think she's very good at finding the right collaborators So even if she herself or her companies don't really have knowledge maybe about a contract that they are awarded, I think she is very good. She has the skills of choosing the right people to do the work for her.
I can add a bit to that. We know from the leaked emails that Van Oort, so the Dutch dredging company, really liked to collaborate with Urbanvest, with Isabel dos Santos' company, because they said they would be quite certain that the project would go on because of her good contacts, etc. So that's something she had to offer to international firms, I would say.
Yeah. Also, I might add that in the data, her voice is really not prominent. So we see a lot of emails between advisors, but we see her voice or her responses are very short and to the point, and she intervenes basically when she has to escalate the request to people close to the government. That's when she really steps in. There is another question. Is there any information yet on what will happen to Docolo's shareholdings? No, I think, right? Karlijn, is there anything in the Netherlands about that?
No, we don't know.
It is a problem in Angola, for example, for the diamond company, because Docolo was basically in charge of that joint venture. So we don't know.
Another question is, did you prove that the leak came really from Rui Pinto and not from someone else? Yeah, I think that's for you, Scilla.
Well, I mean, there are many ways, but I think he himself came for saying that, and we were able to. There was a smaller leak years ago about similar with similar documents, and that too came from him. So I think so. I think we were able to prove that.
Yeah, so the next question is, to what degree has the need to maintain relations with the Angolan government impacted the willingness of the US and EU regulators to pursue potential cases? Well, I can answer it, not answer it for the Netherlands, because we don't know. What we do know is that that the Dutch authorities started a case this year. So this was after our publications, and we know that our publication was one of the reasons they initiated this investigation, which is interesting because the Dutch central bank had information about had questions about Isabel dos Santos' dealings in the Netherlands in 2012 already, but we don't know what happened in the meantime.
Yeah, I may also say that even though in the data or in other public documents there were a few information about her holdings in the US through some Delaware companies, we haven't seen any action from the US authorities. So that's still up in the air. And another thing is that, you know, she said that basically the whole investigation and then the charges against her were basically a political witch hunt, because the current government is blaming them, the Dos Santos, for all the problems that the country now has. So basically, I think it would be. So the government is now trying to actually do the opposite in order to get better relationship maybe with foreign parties. It's better for them to investigate Dos Santos than not doing that.
The next question is there any Russian angle to this story? We know that Isabel dos Santos has been to Russia at least once, and she was on stage with some prominent Russian people. That's the Russian link we know of. But at the moment, and she got a Russian passport, right? Is that correct? No, you can better answer this, Scilla.
Yeah, she also speaks Russian, but we didn't find any Russian links in the data, which obviously doesn't mean that she doesn't have business connections. So you have to remember that this is only a portion of her business activities. We don't claim that we know everything about her. It may well be that now she's doing business in Russia. We don't know that.
Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to our investigative news and documents service and attending our events. For more information, visit offshorealert.com.